Okay, so it is 6:35, and we're hopeful that most of the people who intend to join us have joined us already. My name is Patricia Sesto. I am the Director of Environmental Affairs for the town of Greenwich, and I'm here to welcome all of our participants and panelists this evening. And I'd like to start first by thanking the Coscop Library. One of the best things about the Conservation Commission is all the partners that we have in the community that help us achieve our mission, and we're very grateful to the library for partnering with us to bring this important environmental series to the community. For those of you who don't know, the Conservation Commission, which is part of the Department of Environmental Affairs, is a group of volunteers who are appointed. The commission is a non-regulatory entity whose main charge is stewarding our natural resources, and encompassing that is public education. The Conservation Commission is actually required by state statute, so every town has to have one. And Greenwich has a long, strong history of having a vibrant and effective Conservation Commission. So this evening is part and parcel with that mission of public education. This is actually our third series of environmental issues that have been brought to the community. Last one being cut short last year at this time due to COVID, which I'm sure we all can identify with. Um, the series for this spring is really speaking about the components of our environment: land, water, soil, and speaking to those issues of our interconnectedness, our individual decisions, and how those decisions um, spread throughout our community and beyond, and how through this series we can have a better understanding of what those resources are and how our individual decisions make a difference. And then we'll round that out with climate change. And again, that brings it all back. So we're going to start this evening with what is underfoot: land, and then more specifically, soil. We have treated it poorly. We call it dirt for criminal's sake. We have tried to make it bend to what we think it should be and how we think it should best support our needs. Um, and then I think we are learning, as we do frequently, that we can make our natural resources bend. Rarely can we break them permanently, but in the end, they tend to make us bend, to go back to what should be. Then next week we'll speak about water, how we use it, how we abuse it. We've had a bunch of droughts over the past several years, and that has raised our consciousness associated with water. Um, but there's issues associated with surface water, groundwater. How are those interrelated? What are the regulations that exist that help us protect water, and where are we on our own to make right decisions with regard to our water? And then, keeping with our theme, air, again, how our independent decisions, most notably air pollution sort of decisions, impact this shared resources, this shared essential resource for us. How can we make different choices currently, and what can we expect coming in the future? And much of this talks about transportation being one of our leading air polluters. And when it comes to COVID, it is important when we think about our soil, our water, and our air, what changes have we made over the course of this past year? I'm sure we all can say we've driven less. We might have made more environmentally conscious decisions because maybe we had time to think through. We're home and we can do things differently. What sort of things should stay with us as we go forward? And then lastly, in week 4, putting in context all of our land, water, and air climate change. So we're going to take a step even further back and look at are those resources in the context of climate change, and bring it back to our individual decisions, how it affects us globally. And by time we get there, the 3 primers will have you all in great shape to understand the components of climate change and how we as individuals are responsible for the collective. At this point, I would very gladly turn it over to Myra Klockenbrink, who is going to be our moderator this evening. And hope all of you enjoy the series that we are so happy to bring to you. And I would like to extend a special thank you to Alex Mock from the Environmental Affairs Department, who has taken the lead, again, the third series in a row in bringing these programs to the public. So we're very appreciative of Alex's enthusiasm and her logistical capabilities. Myra?
Thank you, Pat. My name is Myra Clockenbrink, and I am co-chair of the land water sector of the Town of Greenwich Sustainability Committee, and I am delighted to be here this evening. We all know about the threat of a warming climate, but an even larger threat to humanity is the loss of biodiversity in our landscapes. Hundreds of species, including critical insect populations, are collapsing, and with them go the systems we depend upon for our survival. But this is why I am excited to present these panelists to you tonight, because they are giving us hands on the ground actions that each one of us can take into our individual lives and into our communities and governments to reverse these dire trends. Please share what you learned tonight with your family and community, and together, one step at a time, we can restore our environments to the functioning systems we all depend upon. I would like to introduce you first to Jay Feldman. He is co-founder of Beyond Pesticides and has dedicated himself to finding solutions to pesticides problems since 1981. He has worked with farmers through the national advocacy organization Rural America. And since that time, Jay has helped to build Beyond Pesticides advocacy and brings expertise to national pesticide policy. Jay has served on the National Organic Standards Board. Jay's website, beyondpesticides.org, is an amazing resource, not only about pesticides, but food and environmental policy. He has a blog, a YouTube channel, and something he calls Action of the Week. Jay, I don't know if you'd like to speak to a specific action that you're particularly passionate about at this moment, maybe before you start your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Mara. Appreciate the introduction. You know, we realize that this issue of pesticide exposure is very eclectic. We intersect with climate, soil, water, insects, as you say, biodiversity. And so the actions really span that, but they also get into our homes. You know, the action that's up to today or this week is about flea collars and the impact they have on pet populations. But also, if you read the article fully, you'll see their environmental impacts, contamination to waterways and so forth. So we try to address the complexity of these issues in the context of the exposure patterns, the alternatives, the regulatory issues at stake, and what, as you say, what personal responsibility can we bring to the solution to these issues.
Thank you.
So I will share my screen. And here we go. Well, it's a real honor to be with you tonight. Over the years, a lot of important work has come out of Greenwich on this very issue that we're discussing today. We're in many ways focused on how we treat the land. I mean, whether we're talking about beautiful landscapes like this, or we're talking about climate, or we're talking about biodiversity, comes down to how we're treating the land. We attack this problem from the perspective of science, policy, and action. We try to bring all this together. And a lot of our work really was driven by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. You know, the takeaway, every time I reread this book, the takeaway, and it sort of hones in on what's so important about this work, is the addressing complex biological communities. We often forget about how important that is when we make decisions, when we adopt policies and so forth. And that when we introduce a material that is synthetic or made by humans, we are disrupting those living communities, whether we're talking about soil or water or air. Soil, as we'll see tonight, is where the conversation really begins. And specifically, when we're talking about land management, we're certainly talking about soil management. The other thing that is striking about Silent Spring, going back to the 60s, is that Rachel Carson warned us that we need to make better use of alternatives. In this period of time, I think this issue we're discussing tonight, at least the solution as we see it, fits really well within the context of systemic change. We hear a lot about this from the perspective of societal issues, getting at issues we're struggling with as in terms of our social networks and so forth. But systemic change is really the way we need to look at how we manage soil, how we manage and work with the environment. And I think the takeaway for me, whether we're talking about science or policy or activism or advocacy, is to look at what is the system, how is the system operating, and what do we need to understand about that system? And we're just coming out of a period where I think we've learned a lot about how we need to move forward. We understand that science matters. We know that regulations coming out of government can be politicized. We are acutely aware of looming crises. We've already heard in the introduction the reference to climate, and the insect apocalypse is referenced by the New York Times in a New York Times Magazine article back in the end of 2018. Undue corporate influence is really important because whenever we talk about, what we're going to purchase, what we're going to use in our communities, we're interfacing with corporations, and there are a lot of responsible corporations, but there's some that are issuing misleading statements about the impact of their products. And then, of course, at the end of the day, I think democracy and local decision-making is critical to addressing issues of soil management. So when we talk about this issue, we're really talking about the intersection of all kinds of issues, whether we're talking about pollinators or soil, land management, or public health. There is an intersection here. So we have to address these issues in a way that intersects here. One of the issues we hear a lot about is glyphosate. You've read about it in newspapers and articles and so forth. Glyphosate being the active ingredient in Roundup. And, if you just take that one chemical, it's really a window into the complexity of what we're dealing with here. You put glyphosate on the soil, and of course you're going to disturb the living biology in that soil. The interesting thing about glyphosate is that not only is it an herbicide, but it's patented as an antibiotic. So if we're talking about beneficial organisms in the soil, like bacteria being one, or we're talking about fungi in the soil microbiota, we're talking about disruption of the beneficial pieces and parts of that soil microbiota. The same is true for our gut biome, and there is a relationship there between how we treat the soil and how we affect our bodies. So when I talk about this intersection, I think for me, as I work on these issues, yes, there's a direct impact on soil, but how does that relate to larger issues of climate? Certainly, we understand that if we're managing our soil with petroleum-based pesticides and fertilizers and introducing that into the soil microbiome, then we are adversely impacting that soil system. And the UN has said as much on this, that with insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and we cannot forget synthetic fertilizers, we disrupt microbial communities and prevent the kind of carbon capturing that we need to engage in if we're going to draw down the atmospheric carbon. Same thing with biodiversity. Decline in biodiversity, as the UN has told us, threatens society's ability to meet people's basic human needs. And so when we talk about a pesticide as we make decisions, either as households or as communities, we need to understand we're talking about a constellation of formulations of ingredients. So these ingredients, you know, you turn the label over and you see glyphosate, but you also see other ingredients, the majority of which are not disclosed on the product label, and they can be a surfactant or some type of material that in and of itself is hazardous, and we're going to get to that in a minute. We also have contaminants and impurities and metabolites. So this becomes complex. Talk about complex biological communities. These ingredients that we're throwing at the environment, and particularly the soil, are complex in themselves, and we're seeing impacts on groundwater contaminants, toxicity to birds, toxicity to fish and aquatic life, and then bees, of course. And we know about these indirect effects because when we use a systemic chemical, glyphosate systemic, but the neonicotinoids you've heard about, imidacloprid, these are the chemicals that are associated with colony collapse. And we're seeing even now the monarch butterfly is threatened. But it goes beyond that, of course. Studies done in urbanized areas, even one in Connecticut, that shows that the rate of deformities in amphibians is actually higher in the urban environment with runoff from lawns and so forth than in agriculture. But here's the thing. We as a society haven't addressed these problems systemically, okay? So we tend as a society to focus on individual problems that emerge in the scientific literature. So in my own lifetime, you know, there are arsenicals these are arsenic-based pesticides. DDT was still in use for certain uses and certainly as a contaminant. Chlordane, you remember that for insecticide use, drenching the soil around our homes. Dieldrin, endrin, heptachlor, 2,4,5-T, 1/2 of Agent Orange, and then more recently, you've heard about chlorpyrifos. So what did we do when we recognized the harm of these chemicals? Well, we moved to other chemicals. We moved to the neonicotinoids, imidacloprid. We moved to atrazine, triazine. We embraced 2,4-D and glyphosate, certainly. We call this the whack-a-mole approach. And this is where the contamination comes in. This is the US Geological Survey. So if you see you see the use patterns here on the left side of the slide. This is our glyphosate use. I mean, it's become integral to no-till farming and the basis of genetically engineered GMO agriculture. And so when you hear about regenerative, that is no-till, unless we're asking very serious questions about what are the no-till practices. There are organic no-till practices, but they aren't typically what people are referring to. We've got to ask, what is the impact of that chemical on the soil system? And here's what I was talking about earlier when I said there are other ingredients or breakdown products. These are the other ingredients or breakdown products. AMPA is what is being found in the environment. Okay, so we're seeing it in ponds and wetlands, in soil, streams, large rivers, ditches, soil sediment. So we can't just look for the active ingredient when we're looking at contamination. We have to look at these breakdown products, these ingredients that are integral either as a part of the manufacturing process, or they could be a function of oxidation or some chemical reaction in the environment. So how does this all happen? Well, it happens because we have a federal law that allows it to happen. And this is where our actions of the week, I think, become very important, because if we're going to solve community problems, yes, we can make decisions in Greenwich, and we'll see later what those are, but we're affected, we're downstream from other communities. Chemicals drift from our neighbor's home or from the neighboring community. And the underlying federal statute allows this to go on through a risk assessment process. One of the key elements I think we're missing when we have this discussion on systemic change is asking the question whether we need a material to achieve a pest management goal. And often we find that we don't. And we often also find through this risk assessment process that we don't know as much as we should about the chemicals that are being used. We don't know about mixtures or synergistic effects. We don't have good data on adverse impacts across the board when we're making the regulatory decisions. So when we talk about this shift in orientation to systemic change and looking at systems, we're immediately thrust into this realm of working with nature. In the agriculture sector, they refer to this as ecosystem services. What is nature doing that we should be respectful of and work with? If you haven't read the book Teeming with Microbes, I think it really addresses what this session is about tonight. Healthy soil is teeming with life. When we use chemical fertilizers, we injure microbial life. We can garden in a way that strengthens the soil food web. What is that soil food web? Now, we asked these questions when we wrote the Organic Foods Production Act. You know that symbol in the grocery store you see, USDA organic, right? That is born out of this federal law. What this law did is we looked at FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, the federal law that allows pesticides. We said, what's wrong with this law? How does this law allow all these contaminants from DDT to chlordane and all these adverse impacts on water quality, on eagle death, on disruption of ecosystems? How does that go on for decades? We say we want to break that dependency, and we designed this law to require organic systems plan a plan in each case. So if I'm a certified farmer and I'm selling a product that's organic, I have to have an organic system plan. I may not use synthetic inputs as the default. There are exceptions to that. I must protect and enhance biodiversity. The decisions on, and by the way, under this law, no synthetic fertilizers are allowed to be used. No synthetic fertilizers are allowed to be used. So we use things like these planting of plants. So these are flowers in this case, to attract beneficial organisms. And so that is part of a systems change in terms of how we're managing, and it takes on a holistic approach. So we're looking at biodiversity, biological cycles, soil biological activity, and we're emphasizing management practices. You notice we haven't even talked about products yet. We're talking about cultural, biological, and mechanical methods. And then the products that are introduced into this system must be compatible. We call that compatibility with organic systems, and they must be essential to that management system. So here are some hedgerows as an example of what's missing in a conventional system. We don't see this in agriculture typically because we're spraying herbicide, killing habitat, killing milkweed, allowing runoff, allowing the food and habitat for pollinators and so forth. So the organic system plan is critical to this. It's required in an organic system. Inspection certification is a part of that system. And again, we're protecting and enhancing biodiversity. So here, the studies are there. I mean, this is not just an abstract conversation. We know that in an organic system, we're seeing a higher rate of floral, bee, and butterfly diversity. We see continuity of flowering species, and we see a depression and hopefully reduction in insecticide and pesticides. So pesticides includes herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. And the systemic solution is one that eliminates petroleum-based pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. So here's the deal when we're talking about this. We're not just talking about emissions when it comes to climate. We're talking about soil sequestration and of carbon, and to what degree are we doing that through the management of our soil system. This chart really explains where we're at. If we think systemically, as this chart on the right indicates, the longer the petal, the greater the benefit. So we see increased benefits in soil quality. Look at the leaf here in soil quality. It's half as long. We minimize energy, we increase biodiversity, we minimize water pollution, we increase ecosystem services, we protect workers, and we minimize residues on our food. Now, we made a conscious shift away from integrated pest management years ago when we saw that integrated pest management did not eliminate pesticides or come up with this list that we came up with as part of the Organic Foods Production Act. And by the way, I sat as an appointee under the Obama administration on the National Organic Standards Board. So I'm very aware of the actual technical review process that goes on to make these determinations. And so we're now moving on to trying to apply these concepts to protecting pollinators. So here's what we do. We go into communities and we take this orientation, soil-based, and we start asking questions. Many land managers already ask these questions. So what's your soil texture? What's your soil chemistry? Here's where the questions are not asked. What is the soil biomass and the microbial activity in the soil? So we do a soil food web analysis. And in that soil food web analysis, we're looking at all the issues around soil biology. And we take, from that standpoint, we take a feed the soil approach rather than a reductionist approach to feed particular target organism, target plants, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then we ask, well, what cultural practices must we integrate into this soil system? By the way, in an organic system, we do have no-till systems. They're just based on nitrogen fixing legumes that get crimped into the soil so we can eliminate the herbicide use and we can eliminate any synthetic fertilization. How do we do this? We codify these concepts in local policy. Montgomery County, Maryland relies on the allowable list under the organic law. It identifies all the allowable materials that are compatible and essential to organic systems and meet the standards of organic. This is through this Federal Register notice and through this list that EPA maintains of exempt pesticides. And we work with communities like Montgomery County and like South Portland, Maine, to basically work through this systems approach to soil management. And there are fascinating opportunities here to apply these principles at the local level. We really see it as a precautionary approach. In other words, and this is something the US Fish and Wildlife did when it came to neonicotinoid pesticides back in 2016, basically they're saying, look, if I put a chemical on my lawn as a pre-emergent herbicide, I am basically following a recipe that is not even necessarily in sync with my needs. So I'm doing the same thing when I use a coated seed. If I go down to a big box store or a hardware store, I may be buying a seed that's coated with a fungicide or coated with neonicotinoids. And so what I'm doing is I'm prophylactically applying a chemical to a biological system without any indicator of even need at that point. We're taking it a point beyond there, and we're saying, look, we can identify an approach. We can identify an approach that basically says, look, we can adopt a precautionary approach by identifying the practices that can prevent the infestation, the disease, and affect the outcome, the aesthetic, the type of landscape that we want without dependency on the chemicals. Now, years ago, the town of Greenwich was onto this, okay? So the town looked at how do we tackle these issues? And this is the model we used to use. We used to go to communities and say, what can we take out of the system that we're worried about? And Greenwich had this conversation and said, we can take carcinogens out of the system, we can take out endocrine disruptors, and we can take out chemicals that have adverse impact on organ systems. We realized that this did not advance a systemic approach, a systems approach to managing soil in a way that was comprehensive and holistic. And so now we're moving to this system that relies on inputs that are compatible with organic systems. And that's the story. I know there've been a lot of work done since this conversation was had in Greenwich, and there's been a pledge in Greenwich about the Safe Lawn Pledge and efforts to move beyond eliminating certain chemicals, moving toward an approach that embraces soil systems and management practices that are in sync with nature and in fact enhance nature. So with that, again, I appreciate tremendously being here and all the work that's gone on in Greenwich over the years that's so important to this issue. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate it. And now I would like to introduce you to Michael Stragel. Strangel. I'm going to get it right, Michael. Stangel.
Okay, don't worry about it.
He is the owner of Stangel's Enviro Lawn Care. He's a researcher and a regenerative soil advocate. Michael inherited a conventional lawn care company that has evolved it with regenerative practices that focus on building living soil. And he joins us from St. Catharines in Ontario. Michael, I know you are a kiss the ground advocate for regenerative farming. When we think of farming in America, we tend to think about big agriculture and vast fields of wheat, corn, and soy. But I wanted to ask you about the role of small farms that grow our fruits and vegetables and the diverse plantings that we need in our diets and in our culture. I thought you might say a word about that before you start.
Great, thank you for the question. With respect to our local area, we have a lot of small farms with regards to family, and the community comes at large to these farms and they purchase the seasonal vegetables to the fruits. We have grapes, peaches, pears, we have everything, cauliflower, broccoli, you name it. We have everything in this area. So no, it is very important for the small farm from 1 acre to 10 acres. We've got them throughout this area. For the community at large, and especially regenerative, where we can create a more wholesome, more dense nutrition, one that has the biology that comes and replenishes our own biome.
Thank you.
Here, you might. Do you want me to start?
Yes, would you?
Yes. Oh, we're going through this again.
Well, take your time.
Thank you.
Technology.
Okay.
Takes a minute to load.
Yes,
It's all right.
I do apologize.
Okay.
We are in a rural area here, so I am on a different type of internet here, that's for sure.
You're just on the other side. Oh, there we go. There we go.
Can you see the entire screen? Because I've,
Yes, I can.
okay, let me just, mine's still loading on this side.
Okay.
Myra, do you actually see my actual screen slide or the actual entire screen?
What I see, just one slide, it says regenerative lawn builds resilience and security. And now
Here
it's
it goes.
now it's loading. Yeah.
Now it's kicking in. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. You know what Jay was saying there, a lot of that resonated with me too, and I'll be bringing it up through this presentation.
Yeah.
Because I started off in lawn care way back when, but we'll wait till this, it's still loading a bit. And I just want to thank everyone, especially Myra, for asking me to be here. It is a pleasure, and I appreciate you all being here for us tonight, because it's very important for what we're doing. This is just a bit of an outline of who I am. I started back in 1981, the top there, in conventional lawn spray. I thought, and I was taught this way, that lawn care was just the application of fertilizers and spraying. Yeah, we used chloridane back in 81, 82. I can remember that. Very potent. It killed off all the worms, killed off all the biology. Then it was banned here in Canada. Also, we were using Dursban for the longest time too. But as you go through, what I was always trying to do is better myself. And within that, trying to find a solution to a better lawn. But not only that, I was looking at the problems that I was causing. And so just recently, Gabe Brown, which is a regenerative farmer, went over.
Just
Yes?
one thing, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can only see like about 2/3 of your slide. It's not the whole thing. Is there a screen adjustment that you can make there for like screen view or something?
Okay, let me just see.
I see Gabe. I
You
see
just see
Gabe,
Gabe,
but
you don't
I
see
don't see
anything else?
all of Gabe.
Okay, let me just, Hold on. Let me stop share for a sec.
Okay,
And
go ahead.
I do
While
apologize
you
for this.
start that, I wanted to just tell our audience that Jay was speaking about glyphosate. That's the active ingredient in Roundup, and that we all use. It's so commonly used. And I learned this week that it has been banned in Europe, and even Russia plans to ban glyphosate by 2025. We have not banned glyphosate in the United States. There you are. You're all
Are we good here?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So I watched the video this past week, and your Miss Hayes, a congresswoman for your state, mentioned that you guys had one of the longest droughts since 2000 in the year 2016 to 2017, that your national average of temperature increased overall 2.5, but your state went up 8 Fahrenheit, 8 degrees. And in 2017 and 19, you guys had some really bad storms, 2 severe storms through the season and 2 severe winter, costing you over $1 billion in losses. And that all stems to how we manage our land. And see if I can get to the next one. Wow. Just bear with me. There we go. It's taking its time loading. So this is me back in 1985. I looked at lawn care like anyone else. It's an application of fertilizer, synthetic, in our sprays. That's Dursban right there, midsummer, going after grubs. You can see I wore a respirator, rubber boots. My right hand, I don't have a glove on, but there's a glove on my left hand that held the hose. By the end of the day, we would be spraying the size of a football field a day. I was having a lights toxicity. I was dilated pupils and dizzy. So I knew there was something then wrong with what I was doing, and I had to make a definite change. So back in 2014, I started looking at the soil differently, and I went into a regenerative. So this is an actual slide of what soil looks like with fertilizer and sprays. It's empty, it's dirt, it's regenerative. So you're gonna have compaction, you're gonna need to water more, you're gonna have mineral runoff, as Jay was saying, you're gonna get more dirt erosion, which is filling up our rivers. And then again, with lawn care, we are addicted to the fertilizer and sprays because you don't have the biology there, and you're not gonna get that natural greening up. So you're gonna be putting more fertilizer on, more sprays, and that, what we call that is the moron approach. It takes no thought to keep putting it on, but as long as you're smiling and signing the check, we'll just keep putting more on for you guys. And then nature engages by growing plant diversity, and we see that as a weed, and we actually go out there and we spray more chemicals on there, and all that does is compounds the problems, bringing more insects and disease in. And at the same time, we're seeing this year after year after year. So we would look at that and say, some of us would look at it and say, okay, there's a commonality here, but others would say this is nothing wrong, it's just part of business, let's put more product on. Okay, so healthy soil looks like this: sand, silt, and clay, about 45%, 25% air, 25% water, and plus or minus 5%. We really, on the home front, have less than 1% organic matter. And the plant itself is trying to reestablish that organic matter by sending down all its sugars into its roots. Meaning it's trying to go down and feed everything that you see in this soil. You got protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, fungus, and bacteria. But really what you're doing is by building that soil, you're building resilience, security, minerals 24/7, soil structure and infiltration. And as you can see, what I put to the top here, 1 healthy teaspoon of soil contains the population on the entire earth. So approximately 7.8 billion people. I use extracts, and in those extracts, I don't use compost teas. It takes too much time, and there could be outcomes you don't like in it. Extracts are based on a compost that's fully finished and mature. And so if we took 2 pounds of extracts like you see down at the bottom, you literally are going to have 1,497,600,000,000 organisms being applied to a 1 acre. And that works out to 34+ million organisms per square foot. That's a lot of workers that can go to work for you for free if you just got the biology back into the soil. Little lag. Here's a picture of what we've been looking for in our soil. Down the middle, you'll see a fungal mycelium. So fungus is in the regenerative soil. It increases your rooting mass by 1,000-fold to grab and release minerals. It actually makes enzymes and acids to break down those minerals. And what it's doing is, in exchange for the sugars of the plant's telling the fungus that I need this, this, and this, and that fungus is going out and getting it. And in the process of it breaking down organic matter, it can produce water. And that water then can be supported and supplied to your plants. Now, this is not just lawns. This is across the board, any plant. So fungus is also building the macro aggregates for greater structure, infiltration, and holding power. The micro aggregates are the very smaller ones. We'll get into it. That's basically what you see here, these dark areas. Those are the micros. The macro is the entire ball glued together through the glomalin. I didn't want to get too technical, so I was trying to keep it dead simple for us. What happens if the soil organic matter changes? On the left is a regenerative, on the left is a conventional, on the right is regenerative. And what happens is that when we apply fertilizer to these scenarios into this soil, like every lawn, we get this flush of growth. We're very visual people. And so we ID that when we fertilize and we get good growth, that it's working. But what it's doing more so is burning off the carbon or the organic matter in the soil to produce that. So that's your currency exchange. You're losing the organic matter, the holding capacity for your moisture. And on the right, what we're doing is building the life. And as you can see, there are some plant diversity, clover up there's a legume. But again, we're building life within the soil for that plant to become undependent on the fertilizers on the left, but more on the biology that's going to be giving and providing all the minerals and nutrients for the coming days and seconds and minutes of the years to come. And again, the difference between the two, you can see on the left, your air and your water have disappeared, which means the infiltration rates will have gone down. Your organic matter is disappearing. So you're going to get far more compaction. And on the right, again, you're at the 40, 30, 30, 10. 10% is really good. Once it's hard to get to, though, in organic matter. That's a few years of building. My soils are at 5 to 8% in organic matter. So this is an application of fertilizer on your lawn, farm, or wherever. And typically in your neighborhoods, this is what you would see after an application. It is everywhere. It's off target. And even it's on target, it's still off target. So NPK is the basis of all your programs. And this is technology from 1840. You know, if we look at technology advances from 1840 to now, everything else is advanced except for this rude and crude way of providing for the plant. And as I say here, if the fertilizers and spray programs applied to our farms and up to our front doors are all that great, wouldn't us and all the planet be healthier? I'm a guy who uses organics, but I don't like some of the organic products because here's the evidence here. Some of the organics just go beyond and still damage. They're degenerative. But yet I do use a lot of organics, but I will never use one that's been registered as a pesticide to control these weeds. And as you can see here, as Jay was mentioning earlier, fertilizers are salts. You're literally salting the ground. So every application you're putting on there, you're destroying the infiltration rate, you're destroying the structure, you're destroying the life, you're destroying that ability to hold the moisture, which means you're going to get this. Yeah, it doesn't look good. At the same time, water's going to hit that and run off. And I'm going to show you. In this scenario here on the left, a degenerative soil is compacted, as I've been mentioning, but what will run is the water. Now, when you guys water or when it rains, your fertilizers and sprays are soluble. They're going to break down and they're going to flow. Berkeley University had a stat out that your nitrogen, 10 to 20% of it's only used. Your phosphorus, 1 to 2% is only used. And your potassium locks up. And unless it rains, you're going to have a lot of movement. The majority of your product is either going to gas off or move with the rain, or you're watering into our streams, rivers, and lakes. Or on the other side, we can see that the natural process of the the soil food web is happening and providing to the plant. And the plant is taking in the sun, creating photosynthesis, and the sugars are exuding out through the roots. Out through the roots to feed the biology. I don't have a timer on. That's why I'm kind of going fast. Am I good still?
Keep going, Jay. You're doing fine. You've got another 5 minutes.
Okay. So with respect to runoff, it's not just the farms. It is more, majority of it is coming from us, the guys in the lawn industry. Collectively, this is Lake Erie. So you've got the shores, that's Ontario to the top, that's you guys to the left and to the lower end. And this is algal blooms, and that's Pelee Island down here to the point there. But along the shore, this is a reoccurrence year after year. You're going to get the blue, green algal, and you're going to get cyanobacteria, which we had a lot of in Lake Ontario this year too, along Niagara Lake. Not only that, we're going to get the runoff into your oceans, and you're going to get the red tide down there by Florida, and all those dead zones all up along your coastline and around you guys. So every time we fertilize, think about this, you're only getting up to 27% use of what you put on. The rest of it is either gassing off, and for those guys who are asthmatic, you're going to be smelling a little ammonia and all these other gases. And then anyone else who's downstream of you is going to be drinking it as a nitrate, a phosphate, which are carcinogens. Everything that we're putting on seems like it's good, but it's not. It produces a green plant, but it's all deadly to you. Now, sometimes it's not our fault. The home builders build some great homes, but they take outside literally for granted. And this is what we're left with. And literally, we need those fertilizers and sprays. That's the only way we can get stuff to grow. But it's not. If we had the builders do something right from the start, we wouldn't be put in this position. You wouldn't need all those chemicals. And for sure, putting any fertilizer and sprays on this is running off over that curb and into our sewers. And again, lawn care guys are out there, cutters, and they're cutting in the midsummer. This is causing compaction, and then those guys are fertilizing, and the fertilizers are going to run off just from the compaction caused by that guy on the mower. The other is on those conventional lawns, you're going to see temperatures rise up. You're going to see issues. On the left picture, 136 Fahrenheit. Over here is 90 Fahrenheit. And that's crabgrass growing in that picture. And it's just 3 feet apart on that guy's front lawn. And what you'll find is nature will grow a plant in place to protect its skin, to get that sun, to produce sugars, to send it in the soil, to keep that health moving, no matter what plant. It's acting like a suntan lotion, like our suntan lotion to our skin. It's trying to protect itself. And again, I'm just reminding you about the compaction. I know we got 5 minutes. This is what Jay was talking about, the soil food web. These are the main characters that we're putting back in the soil, so you guys can have that soil food web working 24/7 year round. And if you didn't know, we have over 74,000 tons of nitrogen in the atmosphere floating at any time. So why are we putting on all that nitrogen when we got it freely available? Nitrogen fertilizers really only came available after the Second World War. Here's one of my lawns on a street where everybody looks at their lawn as a trophy. There's some flowers you can see in there. They're annuals, unfortunately. But this is what regenerative does. It builds a soil teeming with life, leaving it better than I arrived. And you can see this lawn right here in the forefront, right especially towards the curb. That's high salt impact. That's the mower turnaround. You're getting compaction. That is bad management. Where on the other side, and that's midsummer, July, and it's actually half decent. What I use is a highly fungal dominated compost that's data driven. We add worms throughout, which adds even more power to it. And as you can see, when it's finally finished, I can make a clay ball out of it. I make extract, which we call nature's brew. Within that is all that life I was telling you. It's 34 million different organisms. Here is some examples. When we started this lawn in 2018, it had snow mold. On the right, the next spring, we had no more snow mold, but we're still working through legacy issues and compaction, probably chemicals and everything else. And down below, you can see in a 24-month time frame from the first to the last. And when we get there this year, I'll update this, we should see greater results. It does work. Some work slow, others can work faster. Again, this is a nematode, and this is a specific fungus that snares it and eats it. This is a very rare find. We found it within our compost. Here's another example. I went out to look at it on the 27th. The 4th, the stump was removed. We put an application of our extract on. Then I came out on the 16th. I just aerated. I put some seed on. I used 12 different types. I put a mycorrhizal in it with it, and I followed up with another spray. So that didn't take that long. It's less than a couple of months. And now I can't wait to get back there in the spring again. This is one of our sports fields. We have the only sports fields in Niagara that are all turf and all regenerative, no chemicals and no fertilizers. Again, our fields here, we have one field and that's for every team, that's for every practice. It's a dog to try to keep those things healthy. This is a mycorrhizal fungus. This is what we're looking for. And this is what's going to associate with all plant life except for the brassicas. And why I do it is because of my customers. My customers are families, they're mothers, they're corporate over here, the wineries. There's that gentleman up on the left, his backyard goes on to our St. Catharines Golf Club. Our lawn is better than the golf club at times, but they got a new superintendent who's into regenerative now. And we're seeing that a lot here in Ontario. Golf courses are turning regenerative, municipal all the way down to private or up to private. This is a tardigrade. This is a water bear. This is what we're finding now that we've got a lot more health appearing after a 3-year period. This went into space. It could live anywhere. So look that up. It's a water bear. This is a rare find for us. So how do we turn this to that? Because you guys want something to do right away. Like Jay would say, you got to aerate, open up that ground, allow more gas exchange, get that air in, top dress. Not all compost is compost. You may want to use a worm extract. That's what I'm putting down at the bottom. And I use a 12 blend seed. Why I do that? Because seed is opportunistic. Now I could put a full shade seed in there, a full sun seed. It'll work in all those areas, but together they'll become opportunistic in the position I place them. I use a fish hydrolysate, and for you guys to get you off fertilizer, really simple. Just start putting molasses on through an Ozen sprayer at 1 ounce 1,000. It's going to push a lot more bacteria. It's not going to do too much for the fungus. That's where the fish hydrolysate comes in. You really want to try to grow balance within your soil. A lot of us, I found this in a white paper on regenerative, came out of New Zealand. I like this. It's a cartoonist. It's just up the street here from me. I asked for permission to use it. We're very symptomatic. We look at the symptom and we want a cure for it. If we go all the way back, our soil is broken. We've got dirt. We don't have the biology to support the plants. We don't have the biology to support the crops. We don't have the biology to support our own immune, our own biome. If we look at the soil, we can cure a lot more problems than we know. And as I finish off, I think I only have a few minutes. As I finish off, this is a stenciled handprint in a cave from thousands of years ago. All these hands had an impact on today. What is your impact on tomorrow? I'm always here. I know I kind of ran through this pretty quick and I tried to fit a lot in. So there's some information. You can contact me. I really appreciate your time. And I appreciate if you do have any questions, send them my way. I'll answer them.
That's great, Jay. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. So exit. Yeah.
Thank you. And now I'm thrilled to introduce Jacqueline Elgin, AKA Jackie. And she's worked and consulted in the corporate world for over 4 decades before she retired and discovered a new calling in conservation and nature in Wilton, Connecticut. Jackie became a master gardener in 2006, chairs the Wilton Conservation Commission and the town's tree committee. She co-chairs the Conservation Committee of the Wilton Garden Club and is a founding member of the Northeast Pollinator Pathway. And I have heard the story of how you helped to found Pollinator Pathways, Jackie, but I would love to hear from you just how it happened that you came to create what has become one of the leading grassroots environmental movements of our time. Would you care to speak to that a moment before you start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you. The Pollinator Pathway grew out of a project that was going on in Fairfield County called the Fairfield County Regional Conservation Partnership. And it was really made up of land trust folks that wanted to find ways to increase land stewardship. One of the people on the Fairfield County Regional Conservation Partnership was Donna Merrill, and she lives in Wilton, and she came up with a mechanism to get free trees. And she put out a note and she indicated to folks that they had free trees, and whereas they were having a really difficult time getting people interested in talking about stewardship and landowner responsibilities, all of a sudden everybody was interested in free trees. Donna sat down with us. She was then involved with the Wilton Land Conservation Trust, and some of us from the Garden Club in Wilton and from the Woodstock Nature Center and the Norwalk River Watershed Association, we all sat down together and we started talking about how we could get going with trying to do some things to help our environment and get people interested in taking care of the land. And what we sort of hatched out was a pathway. Looking at Wilton, there's a lot of green space. There's a lot of there are a lot of trails and forested areas. And as we looked at a map that we had, we realized that there were two main roads in Wilton in particular that had a lot of greenways, and that we could try and start patching them together by getting people interested in serving in between to grow things that would be helpful to the wildlife. And that's where the Pollinator Pathway came about. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So I am happy to be here to talk about these things. And I want to start by talking about the importance of soil. And I'm not going to spend much time because you've heard from the experts already. But I think that from a gardener's perspective, it's been pretty clear to most of us that we depend on our soil for our plants because it gives them physical support and the essential nutrients that they need. The plant growth depends on oxygen and water in the soil, in addition to the biological activities that you've been hearing about and actually seeing some pictures of. These organisms that live in the soil include fungi and earthworms and even small mammals, as you saw in the chain, in the food chain. There are 5 soil forming factors that are involved. First of all, climate and vegetation and the topography make a difference. And then the parent materials, which are bedrock and rock debris. And over time, and they're talking about centuries and longer, they get worn down into sand, silt, and clay. And in an ideal world, you should be able to take this sand, silt, and clay, and you have soil in various types. While soils vary from place to place, the soils which are suited for plant growth are pretty similar in their pore structure, in their water distribution being even throughout the root zone, in their oxygen for root respiration and microbial activities, and in adequate nutrient supply. Plants help by putting carbon and nitrogen back into the soil as they grow and as they're using photosynthesis. And the damaged soil that we may have inherited can be converted back into healthy, fertile soil with good stewardship and with sustainable practices. But I think a lot of gardeners don't realize that soil and plants have an interdependency. It's not just one direction. Plant growth is influenced by soil structure because of the movement of the water and the air and the roots around us, around the roots. And organic matter builds that structure, and it can be ruined by compaction, as you saw earlier. On the other hand, the plants are giving back to the soil as they grow. The roots are enlarging the pores in the soil, And as they die, even the plants are leaving channels where water can penetrate, and they're creating humus and leaving microorganisms behind. So you can kind of think about soil in a way similar to our feet. All of the weight of our body is poised on these relatively little objects that hold up this big mass. And a sore toe can even stop you from walking. And likewise, when you have soil that provides the structure and nutrients to the plants, it's supporting all of that biomass of the plant. And its roots input to the soil, whether they're alive or dead, to improve the texture and the composition of the soil. You heard before and saw a number of pictures of large equipment running around people's yards. And it's a lot easier to prevent than to cure structural breakdown of the soil. Avoiding compacting is really important. And even though most people in the old days, and old days meaning until very recently, would turn their soil every year using big rototillers, the thinking now has changed, and people are trying very hard not to cultivate this, the soil unduly, not to use it, to do it when it's too moist and not when it's too dry. And the less you disturb the soil, the better it's going to be. You want to be able to take the soil in your hands and press it into a ball. And then if you open your hands, the ball will stay intact. But then if you take a finger and press the ball, it will actually collapse. And that's the texture of the soil that we're aiming for. One thing that we can do to avoid getting too much compaction is to make and use some small paths and use maybe putting in some stepping stones so that you can hop from one to the next as you're gardening. And as you walk around through your garden to take a look and admire your hard work without actually walking over the plants and stepping down on the soil. Before you start actually planting your garden, if you already have one, replanting for the season, the important thing is to always do a soil test first. It's a little late to be talking about this now. Generally speaking, you should be starting in the season before so that if you have changes to make to your soil, you can make them in advance and they can be well integrated into your soil by the time you're ready to start putting in plants. The way you do it is this. Take a big bucket out in your yard and a cup, and from about 10 places in your garden where you think you're going to be putting in plants, take a cup of each from each space of about 10 places. Put them all in the pot together, stir them all up, and extract 1 cup of them and put them in a plastic bag. Then you can send them either to Yukon in stores or to the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, CAES in New Haven. And the links for those are here. And they will ask you to fill out a form, which they have on those sites, and to send them a small check. And in return, in a few weeks, you will get a report from them that tells you a lot about the condition of your soil and some recommendations for what you can do to amend it. And you want to be sure to follow those recommendations. Otherwise, most of this was for naught. You don't really want to be amending your soil right before you put your plants in. So be sure to try and do this in advance. Compost is the gift that we give back to the earth. It's an amendment or a fertilizer, and it's basically the decomposition of everything organic. And it includes all kinds of organisms that we're trying to stimulate to break down the food that we've put in. These are generally table scraps or garden scraps that you've got. And you want to be sure not to put in anything that is invasive. But certainly from your garden, those things would be good, and from your kitchen. Anything that's organic can be composted. Sorry. But generally speaking, we don't put in meats and dairy products in the compost pile. That's because, first of all, they may attract critters to your garden, to your compost heap, and they'll make their homes there, eating away. Second of all, it takes a really substantial amount of heat to break down something like bones, meat bones. So if you are in a community that can send all its compostable scraps to put them out somewhere, and someone will come along and collect them and take them away to a professional composting site, they have the capability of creating a great deal of heat that can break down everything that's organic. And then you can buy compost to put on your soil. In our home composters, we really can't generate that much heat. So the composting returns the nutrients which remain in the plant materials and other organic foods after being broken down by microbes and fungi and many other organisms, including worms and beetles and flies and centipedes and millipedes and many, many other types. So let's just sort of change track here for a minute and talk a bit about fragmentation and the ecosystem. A couple of hundred years ago, Connecticut was much more rural, and our communities had a lot of open spaces and some small farms, and they would be blended together seamlessly. So the organisms, the animals and insects and birds, all and we humans that lived on this land, which is this big green space here that you can see, were able to move around easily from one spot to another to get food and to find habitat and to find safety. But what happened was over the last couple of hundred years, we've become urbanized and suburbanized. And what was once was one big square or rectangle is now a number of smaller ones that are broken up by areas that don't have any way for animals and insects to get from one spot to another. The wildlife can't forage when it's so far apart, especially bees which can't fly that far. And they can't find habitat in some cases, because if they leave here, they may not have the capability of going all the way over here where there were safe havens for them. So what we've realized is that we need to connect the fragments by using private properties to connect the pathways with the public spaces. So here we have these public spaces that are these rectangles, and we consider ourselves in the little circular spaces of the private properties. And we can fill in the gaps by planting native trees, shrubs, plants, providing water, providing habitat. And then why am I not going to the next one? Suddenly it's not moving forward. Not sure what to do about this. Ah, there we go. But we went a little too far. So as I mentioned earlier, a number of us got together in 2017, about this time of year, and started the Pollinator Pathway in Wilton. We put together this little logo of the spring azure butterfly, which is hosted by the American Dogwood. And we had to have it flying up over Wilton. We gave a talk, but we had a panel discussion and some talk in 2017 in the spring. And about 80 people in Wilton showed up for it, which was pretty exciting. It turned out that there were also some people there from Weston, which is the adjacent community to us, and from Westport, which was also adjacent. And as they were leaving, they were saying, we want to have a pollinator pathway too. So we started talking with them about the ways that we were going about this and about the 3 tenets that we use to help guide our thinking. The next thing we knew, as of now, we have more than 200 towns in the adjacent states and in Connecticut. And there are states all over the country actually that are starting pollinator pathways. It seems it was just a hot ticket item at the right time. And in 4 years, it's actually just exploded. And basically without our doing anything to try and make this happen, it just appeals to people and it makes sense. For a lot more information, we encourage you to go to pollinator-pathway.org. And don't forget to put in the little hyphen here. It's really important. And you will get a lot more information about plant lists that you can use and so on, lots of things. So a pollinator pathway basically is a pesticide-free corridor of native plants that provide nutrition and habitat for pollinators. And you can think about what's wrong with having a lawn. We're asking people not to put pesticides or insecticides anywhere on their properties if they can do it, and to rethink their lawns. And the reason that we encourage people to try and rethink the lawn is either to make it a bit smaller and put in more plants, or if you're going to keep your lawn, to let it become naturalized. The lawn as it currently exists has almost no nutritive value, and it doesn't preserve or filter water due to the tiny root systems, and it doesn't provide habitat due to the tiny blades. And generally they're heavily fertilized to keep them pure and bright green. The soil and wildlife need much more from what covers the ground, and healthy families and pets do too. They need no fertilizers or pesticides. They need dandelions and violets and spring ephemerals. Oh, it's doing this again. Okay. I had mentioned something about using best practices, and I'd like to talk a bit more about that. Until recently, most people put their gardens to bed in the fall, but that's actually counterproductive for the soil, the insects, and the other wildlife. Doing a cleanup in the spring helps with the completion of the life cycle of many insects, and particularly pollinators. Leaving the leaves where they fall in the autumn provides shelter for insects and protects the roots of trees and shrubs, and offers habitat for bees' eggs to overwinter. Leaving the spent flower stalks upright allows the birds to eat the remaining seeds in the flower heads and protects any bees' eggs that were laid in the hollow stems, while providing winter interest to those who are in a lockdown situation during a pandemic. Mowing as late into May as possible helps guarantee ground nesting pollinators have hatched out before the mower can chew them up. It also ensures the early pollinator-friendly flowers, such as the violets and dandelions, are available for the early hatched pollinators. Then if you can mow only once in 2 weeks or even in 3 weeks, cut only the top third of the blade of grass and let the third that you cut just lay on the ground. It will serve as fertilizer for your grass, and it will enhance the vitality and the fertility of your grass. Nature may prefer some messiness, but that doesn't mean that you can't keep your garden tidy and your yard looking pleasant for your neighbors to see. Creating borders and edges can give the illusion of a contained garden, even though you may have a wildness once you step inside. And perhaps it will encourage your neighbors to come and take a look at what's growing in your yard and to think about doing the same in theirs. I want to talk a little bit about natives versus invasive species. Invasives are the plants that have been imported. Most of them came in as ornamentals, and a few of them came in by accident and escaped from their location. Many of these plants came in as long ago as, say, 1800, so it's not like they're not new, like they are new to the environment. But when they came in, they didn't bring in any of their predators with them. So they can outcompete the natives and they can use up the natural resources in the soil. And generally speaking, they have minimal to no nutritive value to insects or birds, with some exceptions. There are some plants that are invasive that have some very juicy berries that they put out. A good example is the burning bush, or Euonymus alatus. And the birds will eat those up and then fly around and poop them out in the forests, along the trails. And suddenly you have all these invasives coming up everywhere. The natives, on the other hand, have been growing in an area for decades or even for centuries. They're well adapted to the region's climate and soil and weather, and to also to each other. So there are connections between the flowers and the insects, between the insects and the birds, and so on. They can provide the insects and the birds the food and shelter that they need. And many of these plants are what are called host plants for specific insects. And when those host plants aren't in the environment, then those insects will become extirpated or gone from our environment, at least regionally. And this also includes trees and shrubs. I'm sure most of us think about natives and about feeding our pollinators when they're thinking about flowers and annuals, perennials, and grasses and ferns and so on. But the trees and shrubs are among the most important that we have of native species that help support our pollinators and our birds. When we say that we don't want any invasives, it's important to realize that not all non-natives are invasive. Many of them behave very nicely in the garden and they're pollinator friendly. The ideal is to try and plant about 70% natives, and the remaining 30%, if you have some favorites that are not natives, will not make a difference at that point. We have about 2,500 different species of native plants and about 1,500 species of non-natives in Connecticut. Of these non-natives, about 100 are on the Connecticut invasive species list. So there are a lot of choices without opting for invasives. If we look at this, this little chart, what you can see here is that the natives on the right have a much more developed, wider, a lot more small roots and much deeper root system than the invasives do. They really don't establish deeply into the soil, so they don't really enhance the soil as they grow. Turf grass, which is not a native, compared with native grass, for example, turf grass is only an inch or two deep in its root system. Here's another way of looking at it. These are non-natives, but they're not invasives. And here's a big hydrangea that has a very small root system. And here's Kentucky bluegrass, which a lot of us plant in our yards, has a tiny root system and not a very large blade, compared with buffalo grass, which is a native and has this very long root system. What we plant really matters, as I think is becoming pretty obvious. There are also wildlife and plant interdependencies, just as we saw that there were plant and soil interdependencies. A lot of insects and birds depend on plants for their food and their energy and their shelter during their life cycles. And if those plants can't be reached, then, as I said earlier, the insect species will die out. And when the insects are gone, then the birds are going to also fail. All nestlings require protein, and the very best source of protein is caterpillars. On the other hand, many plants depend on the insects, and they also depend on birds and other wildlife to pollinate them. And if there aren't any bees and there aren't any butterflies, then the plants aren't going to be able to reproduce. And about 40 to 60% of the food that we like to eat will not be able to grow. A lot of gardeners would look at this slide with all these strange looking caterpillars and consider that these are bugs and have a negative impact on their property. They look at these leaves and they see that they're being eaten. Here's a monarch eating a milkweed. And they get alarmed and they want to get rid of them all. And the fact of the matter is that insects have a vast and an important role in the ecosystem. And a great number of these are beneficial. A chickadee family requires 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of its nestlings for one season. That's a lot of caterpillars. So if we've gone and sprayed them all and gotten rid of them, then you're not going to have any chickadee babies anywhere that will survive. They can't just eat seeds when they're nestlings. For those insects that are detrimental, using natural or what some people call organic gardening practices, or what I call integrated plant management, and you heard a bit about those from both of the other speakers, can handle these without the use of pesticides by and large. I thank you for your attention, and I would like to point out that there are a number of places where you can find native plants. They're becoming a very hot ticket item now, and it's actually becoming harder and harder to find enough natives. So there are groups that are starting to grow them and to grow ecotypes that are specific to our region. Also, don't forget that there are plant sales again this spring. Last year we missed out on them, but this year they are coming back. Greenwich is Garden Club is planning one. So is the Wilton Garden Club and the Ridgefield Garden Club and the Bartlett Arboretum and Gardens, all three of which do them on Mother's Day weekend. The Aspetuck Land Trust is also doing an online natives garden plant sale right now, and everyone will have native plants available. And I have a few references here that I think are also probably useful to you. If you haven't yet dug into Doug Tallamy's two books, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope, I would strongly urge you to read them. He is inspirational and can really make the case for why what you do on your property can make a huge difference and help to cure the soil and to defragment our environment. Your garden can become an essential part of the whole ecosystem, starting with putting life back into your soil and taking from the soil to nurture and protect our wildlife. Thank you.
Excellent, Jackie. Thank you so much. We were out with Alex today planting seeds, pollinator seeds in the hoop house. So
Great.
we're getting ready. We have a couple of questions. For Jay, you touched on fungicides, insecticides, and neonicotinoids, but did not talk about organics, such as pyrethrinoids or cedar oil derivatives. Would you like to say a word or two about them?
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to explain, I think, is that the default assumption is against synthetics. So anything natural, any material that's natural is on the national list, except those that are prohibited. So we have a number of prohibited naturals like strychnine or arsenic, those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
The beauty about organic, which is different from any of the other systems, is that anybody can petition to add or remove a material from the list. So there is a process that is relatively efficient where if there is a hazard, and we have identified some along the, for instance, when I got on the National Organic Standards Board, antibiotics were allowed in apple and pear production.
Mhm.
So we were able to remove that from the list. We have a saying in organic, continuous improvement. But the beauty of it is it's an established process, it's transparent, it's open to public comment and hearing every 6 months, and there's an actual petition process. Anybody from the industry or from the public interest community or the gardening community can come forward and say, I don't think this should be on the list. We're working with beekeepers on a material right now.
Yeah, and so same person in the chat mentioned that her newly installed bee colonies were killed with tick control spraying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know who sprayed that, or I'd have to look up the active ingredient and whether that's allowed in
Well,
organic.
those companies come through and spray for ticks and on property.
Right, so those are not obviously allowed in organic systems.
Yeah.
You know, it's a very important, I believe that if we have a system and give it a name, there needs to be a good process by which we can update, maintain the scientific review, get input from the community, because, you know, a lot of the technology and the chemistry that's out there is not fully evaluated before it makes its way onto the market.
Right. Yeah, we kind of close the door after the horse is out.
Right.
Someone else here has said, I have used glyphosate not as a spray, but to paint on the cut ends of porcelain berry vines in autumn. It has been very effective in killing the obnoxious vines over winter so that the remains can be pulled out in spring. What is your opinion about that? I've heard that using it on knotweed in the same way, so that the pesticide goes down into herbicide goes down into the root system. What's your opinion about that?
Are you asking
Anyone?
me or?
Yeah, Jay, anybody?
Yeah, I'd be interested in others. I mean, you know, I think what we heard was that, you know, we're having an unintended adverse impact when we're adversely impacting the organisms that live around the root structure, interact with the plant. And our bottom line is that there are other ways to manage these unwanted plants, what it comes down to, that we really need to do a better job of exploring. We heard a lot about that tonight. I think it's a lot of the problems we see, whether it's knotweed or other you know, plants that come into a space are opportunistic, right? They're coming into that system because they see an opportunity. It could be we heard about compaction. We heard about other challenges. We have to correct those situations. And in so doing, using, you know, good aeration, which is not just to get, you know, separate the soil, but plants like turf plants and ornamentals need air around their roots. I mean, you guys know this better than I do, right? That's a requirement in these plant structures. So we're undermining a lot of the needs of the plant material given the management practices. And this creates a treadmill effect. You know, we don't address the stress. We don't address what we heard also, the taking advantage of the soil organisms and the cycling of nutrients naturally. We ignore the value of the environment in which these plants are being grown. And then we become dependent on the pesticide to make up for that lack of management practice.
Yeah.
I would also like to add that
Yes.
there have been a number of people who have reported lately that if you cut the plant, and I'm speaking about Japanese knotweed right now, and I don't know if it would be effective on porcelain berry or not. It might be. You cut it in May, And then again in July and again in late August before it flowers. You will actually, and you do this year over year, you will be able to actually eradicate it. Now, I've heard a variety of things from CIPWIG, the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group. And when this was first proposed, people said that they had not had permanent success with it. But from what I am hearing more recently, it seems that it does work for a very long time. You can't just ignore it. And you have to replant once you've cut it back. You have to replant with natives, and keep an eye on them to be sure that they're not going to be out competed.
I had one question that maybe Michael, you might want to speak to, and that is the ability of the soil to sequester carbon. We hear about this, but how does it work and what is its potential?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. That's a big one. A lot of the short, when you're bacterial dominated soil, a lot of the weeds will appear because you're getting a lot more nitrates. And that's a signal in nature to advance the succession of health within there, meaning health of the plant, or sorry, the health of the soil, dependent upon the chemistry defined by the biology. So what happens, what we were mentioning about some weeds species, those weeds are there to help break open the soil. And as we move forward successionally to a healthier soil, these weeds will drop away because the chemistry itself is changing, and it's all defined by what plant is growing, collecting the sun's energy, putting sugars out. And as each plant dies off, a lot of weeds produce a lot of seed, so they proliferate a lot, and they put a lot of seed in that seed bank. What happens is that it only grows dependent upon the chemistry there. And as you keep pushing chemistry along, and chemistry is defined by the soil food web with the fungus and the bacteria in the biomass ratios, you get the nematodes and the protozoas showing up down the road. But when you start getting all that chemistry, you'll lose that, but you're gaining all that carbon from the sugars and the biomass of what you're building within the soil. And to go back to the weeds, once those weeds die, those roots leave an avenue for air, for gas exchange, for water to go in, for microorganisms to follow down. They break open the compaction, but they leave, like Jackie was saying, that organic matter behind, so the biology can live off that. But not only that, that leaf up top, all those minerals that are available, and they'll release to the surface. So that's why you don't want to rake some of these or be invitation to keep cleaning, because you want that debris field there. That's what nature in a forest is like. You want a debris field at certain times. Obviously on lawns, you want to leave your clippings there. You don't want to be taking those clippings away, because you're going to be needing to put more minerals and nutrients on. So again, a healthy plant at any stage is pushing sugars down, promoting soil health, successionally moving forward, and that is promoting carbon within the soil. And as you progress to a healthier soil, you can lock up even more in that soil. How deep can it go? It can go as deep as the plant's roots.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. I have one other question here about how we can convince municipalities seeking more field time for sports that artificial turfs fields are not good for people, especially young children, animals, and the environment. What about that?
Yeah. Artificial fields suck. That's it. They're nothing good to the environment. The other end, they're made of petroleum products. They cost an arm and a leg, and then you're maintaining it. My son plays AAA baseball. We're on sometimes your fields down in Buffalo. We haven't been over there for a while. It gets extremely hot. You can see the heat rating up. You can get the fumes rating up. He's a slight asthmatic too, so it's problematic. When we get into sport fields and we get into our municipalities, such as my city, they're stuck to budgets, and they got old dogs doing the work. They don't like new tricks. They like conformity, they like comfort, and they understand when I put a fertilizer on, I get that outcome all the time. When you learn something new, that's a fear-based mentality of, oh, what do I do now? What's next? Whereas sorry, as Jay was saying, with recipes, we can always go back to the book and say, hey, I can use this for an outcome. But we're so opportunistic when we see an outcome that's not a positive, that we've got to go to our arsenal to condemn it or do other, which is just complicating it and pushing succession back. I'd get rid of artificial fields. They have their place in some respect, and other, they're not doing anything for the environment. They're not cooling it. They're not absorbing air pollution. They're not absorbing dust. They're not absorbing heat. It's letting it off. It's radiating off more.
Any other comments you'd like to make, Jay?
Well, I think that was perfect. You know, there's no real value. It is petroleum based, the plastics and so forth. The other thing that really upsets me with the artificial turf is the need for antimicrobial, antibiotic types of materials. They're sprayed down to protect against the transmission of disease. So the kids are being exposed to this. And, you know, one of the next epidemics that have been predicted by CDC and the World Health Organization is antibiotic resistance. And there's a lot of cross resistance with antimicrobial. So here we have kids now playing on fields that are disinfected, and those interactions are highly problematic, even on their own. You know, respiratory toxicants. We're having the same problem with COVID, when, you know, EPA publishes a list and you've got these quaternary compounds that are tied to all these adverse effects in the disinfectant. You spray that on a field on an ongoing basis, you're exposing kids to that, and they're immunosuppressive, they're neurological toxicants, and so you're weakening the immune system and the nervous system of the child.
Wow.
And so it's not a long, and the other thing people aren't aware of in a lot of local municipalities is this is an expensive proposition. The lifespan of a field, I mean, you're lucky if you'll get 10 years out of it. And these are multi-million-dollar investments. You know, if you put that same amount of money into an organic or organically managed field, and at a high level, you know, where you're really expensing it for high aesthetic tournament level fields, you wouldn't be spending as much on that field as you would on a synthetic field.
No. Very good. I see there's a note here that wanted to clarify that the Garden Club of Old Greenwich, which holds their plant sale on Saturday before Mother's Day, May 8th at the Eastern Civic Center in Old Greenwich, 8 to 2. So mark your calendar for that sale, get your native plants there. I want to thank you all very much for your expertise and your time and the work that you have put in, decades, all of you together to help us live better on the earth. Thank you so much, and thank everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Take care, take good care, be well, and see you out in the fields.
Yeah.
Picking weeds.
Thank you, Jay, Jackie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Appreciate
Right
it.
on.